The pride of the Australasian scene has been Renegades throughout their various incarnations. Obviously, they really broke out back when they were Vox Eminor, getting upset wins over some of the best teams in the world at Gfinity Spring Masters 2, where it had that interesting format where you played 2 maps against each team in your group. But beyond that, they never really managed to deliver. They didn't qualify for majors pretty much once it became an open qualification system where you couldn't just get invited or win a regional qualifier. In the era where Sponge left as the in-game leader, things didn't really improve that much. They maybe got to a slightly higher level within NA at least, and they got to some lands, but they never really had deep finishes beyond the one good finish at DreamHack Winter, which as an actual tournament didn't have that great a field, and unfortunately they weren't really in a position where they got to play a lot of the very good teams that even were at the event, and they kind of had a bit of a spotty performance, in as much as when you look at the maps even that they had success on, there wasn't really any strong points that stood out like they're amazing, at least on these few maps. It was fairly all over the place, even the maps they got their wins and their losses on. And at this point in time, they've tried pretty much all the options. Like, all the big name players from that region have by now been through the Renegades doors. They've cut the players who were the obvious dead weight. They've taken out players like, obviously Sponge had his issues. Certainly Havoc had some big issues. Now they've done that. They've taken those players out. They've brought in the better players from the other teams. They've tried making like a super team from Australia and New Zealand. And what have we really gotten out of it? Like, they've run out of options at this point in time. And there's young players you could bring in, but that's more of a gamble than trying out some of these established names that we know are good and had international pedigree. So they've gotten to the point where, okay, now they're a good online team within the context of NA. And they have chances to upset offline, but we're talking mainly best of one chances, not winning series over any of the top 10 ranked teams in the world once you get into bracket play. So this is a team where the frustrating part about them isn't that there's some obvious choice they could make or an obvious thing they need to fix. I mean, you could say psychological issues, but that's a very, very deep area to go into, and there's not many people in esports, me included, who really know where you would approach that from. There's some very basic things you could do, like get a sports psychologist if you can, or start reading books on the topic, but again, it's not something that a lot of us can really tell you how to fix. So talking about the basic areas you can fix teams is in picking up players, changing the style of how you play, your leadership, etc. These are things you could do, but at this point they've tried a lot of these things. Now, to give you some context, I always thought once these Australian players got into position where they lived in NA, they were in an NA team, that sooner or later there'd be integration between North American players and this Australian team. Now, when Renegades, the organization, picked up Vox Eminor's lineup, one of the reasons why is when the owner of the team, Monte Cristo, who comes from League of Legends, asked me, since I've worked with him for many years in League of Legends, asked me, like, should I pick up this Australian team? And we were weighing up all the options of who was available in terms of teams out there around that level. There were teams that were of a similar level to Vox Eminor that he could have bid for, maybe paid more money for. And yeah, he could get the Vox Eminor team, in theory, very cheap. But I actually told him a really underrated aspect of this team is you've got to remember, yeah, just because they're from Australia, don't think of them as you always have to get players from Australia, from New Zealand. They have to come from that scene. These guys speak English. They understand the basics of American culture. They've seen many American movies. They understand the music and all the rest of it. Like, they're going to understand it to the extent that you could recruit an NA player who's maybe a player who's good but doesn't fit in at the time a Cloud9, a Team Liquid, and is good, but he's still got to learn his chops, or he's underrated perhaps, or people don't want to play with him in those teams. That's the player that you sign and you bring into your team. You upgrade that way, or you get the piece you want from the NA scene, because ultimately NA and Australian players absolutely could play in the same team. So I thought initially the way it would work would be NA players being recruited into this team. So for example, the players who are in Optic right now, people like, well, Stanislaw was in Optic, people in the past, like obviously you've got NAF, you've got Rush, players like these could have been recruited at the time before they joined Optic, because it's 2015 we're talking about, into a team like Renegades and potentially made them better and potentially shored up some elements of them and given them strengths where they lacked strengths currently in that team. Now that never happened. In fact, the Renegades team continued to only recruit from their domestic scene, even though they lived in NA for most of the time. Now, you can come up with your own reasons for that. What I've heard is that it's because they had some logic that they have their own culture and therefore it wouldn't work to have NA players and they've got to have their own people. Now, to me, that's just bullshit. Like, I understand, yes, there are clear differences between Australian culture and North American culture. But in terms of playing in teams, this would not be an issue. I mean, if Guardian from Slovakia can play with players from Ukraine and Russia, there is more of a difference between those cultures than Australia and North America. In terms of, like, understanding the language, Guardian actually did not understand Russian initially and had to really put a lot of effort into that. In terms of even basic things of the national culture and how they think of things, there's more of a difference there. And the difference is Guardian didn't grow up necessarily watching Russian movies and understanding Russian culture in that sense. These Australian players at least have the basics to be able to make inroads, especially if it's a player who's very amiable who's a North American. So I think they already have missed a trick by spending these 2 years not going down that route and trying to get those players. Now, admittedly, at the time, you could say, well, maybe there wasn't as much money in the scene, all the rest of it. Now I actually think after the failure of Renegades, it should be going the other way. It should be the Renegades players leaving and going to NA teams and finding a team that fits them as a player so that they have more success themselves, and then NA hopefully one day being able to recruit from the Australian, New Zealand scene, because this is the sick thing. There are good players in that scene. There are good players in Renegades. They are just absolutely neutralizing each other and wasting each other's time by staying together. So I actually think you look at the Australian New Zealand team, one issue they really lack for is in-game leaders. So I feel like you want to get some of these players and put them on the right NA teams, and you would have upgrades for NA. You'd have players who are ready-made, able to come in and play with them. In theory, players who can earn more money, have a better career, because unless you're in Renegades, that's about your only chance at the moment to even get a proper salaried career and play at top level international competition if you're from that region. So let's get on with it. What is the delay at this point in time? We've tried the experiment with Renegades. I mean, I know in the past, like we're talking about like middle 2016, there were teams looking at JKS, there were teams looking at ASA, especially before the organization moved to be bought by that Jonas Jerebko guy. Well, teams were looking into it, but the problem is, supposedly, even those players were resistant to it. They didn't really want to leave if it was possible to stay. So, when you consider how much money is in the NA scene now, massive amounts, even for teams that are the 5th, the 6th, the 7th best NA teams, when you consider that NA teams have now shown that they're open to bringing in mixed talent from EU or wherever else. I mean, Splice brought in Machine Gun, for fuck's sake, from Mongolia. Obviously, Mixwell came over and has played in Optic now. You had Simple come over and play with Team Liquid. Splice had a whole bunch of other players. Asilian. Complexity has the UK players. Death. Surreal. At this point in time, it's absolutely the case that these NA orgs would be open if these players are good enough and were willing to play from Renegades and from the Australian and New Zealand scene. So I feel like that scene is just wasting its potential at the moment. Then you've got to add in, here's an underrated aspect people haven't thought of. If a player proved himself to be good enough from Renegades, like proved he was a really good talent, maybe not even just as a pure fragger, maybe as some support role or an AWPer, whatever it might be. There are teams in EU you could join right now. You could go and play in Mouse Sports. It's a team that communicates in English. You could play, I mean, you'd have to be very good to do this and build your name up. In theory, you could play in FaZe. There's another team that's going to communicate in English. There's another team that's using names from around the world. There's a lot of options. If you want to live in NA, EU, there are all these different options as to what you can do. It's not like the old days of 2 or 3 years ago, and there's now no excuse. I mean, imagine some of these, okay. I've come up with a few very simple fits where I would take this player now from a Renegades type team and I'd instantly put him over onto another team and see how it works out. So I would take Azza from Renegades, really good AK player, very good on the T side, pure entry style player. He goes to his spot, he takes his duel, tries to win it. He's got good medium range aim. This is a guy who can do a lot of work aggressively for your team. The team I'd put him into right now is I would put him on a Team Liquid. I'd take Nitro. I'd say, it's been real, Nitro. We had a good time, mate. You can go and join Cloud9 or something. I'd put Azza onto that team, have him be a pure entry, have Elige follow up. That's a team right there that would be better. That's a team that would be better for Azza. That's a team that would be better with Azza. That's a great move you could do right now. JKS. I'd put JKS onto a team like Cloud9. They're a team where they've got a good aggressive core. You've got Stuart UK, Automatics, the mid-round player, where they've really set all that up. Then what happens, though? Then you've got players like Skadoodle and Shroud who really struggle. You've got Nothing who wants to play more of a lurk role, but he's very, very patchy in how good he is. Put JKS on that team, really good decision making late in the game, great passive style of play, really intelligent as to what he does within his team of when to take action, when to stay alive. This is a guy where he's actually quite underrated in that respect, I think. I mean, obviously, if enough people call you underrated, you become overrated to some degree. But in terms of, he'll always be a sleeper in terms of, because his team isn't that good, people never think he's that good a player. Put him on a team like Cloud9, now they get a whole lot more polish to them. Now they're winning a lot more late game scenarios. This is a player where I think that would be a massive upgrade for some of the players they have on their team right now. And if he doesn't have to be the star, this is a key thing about JKS. A flaw I see in him right now is that on Renegades, he has to be one of the star players. He's someone much more suited to being like the Zipniks of your team. If he's like a supportive style player who just puts himself in these clutch situations, now you're going to, and you've got other people as the stars, now you're going to do serious work. You can't expect him. He's never a player who's going to put massive numbers on the board. That doesn't happen very often. But he's going to have those Zipnik style like 17 kill games where he wins the whole game for you by making key plays and either kills that lead to someone else winning the round or winning the round himself in 1v1s. And now another player Cloud9 could absolutely use is one of the AWPers from Renegades. Take Ricky or Yam, throw Skadoodle the fuck out and put those guys in. Those guys, aggressive AWPers, mobile AWPers. Yes, sure, they're more streak AWPers than the old school Skadoodle was, but they could absolutely work in these teams. And when you consider the style of play Cloud9 want to play on T-side, why wouldn't these players fit right in? Even someone like Ostillo, who within this particular era of Renegades has had to be a supportive style player, I tell you where I would put him right now. I'd sign him to Mouse Sports tomorrow. Think of all the issues fucking Spiddy and Dennis have had, where they've just put up some of those garbage numbers you will ever see for a player in what at times has been a top 10 team. Just at times appalling players. Throw a Stillone in one of their spots, this guy would get work done. This guy's, and if it's a team where you can speak English, and admittedly Nico's leaving now, but there's rumours that a good player might join instead. This is a team where he absolutely could shore up the other aspects of the team. Then they've got their star players. Now you're a team that can do work. Now you can legit be a top 10 team regularly in a way Renegades never could be. I mean, the funny thing is, this whole logic actually applies to the UK scene as well. They also speak English. They've also grown up with American culture. In theory, some of them might want to move to America, earn a top salary, be a pro and play against top national competition. Difference is, for the UK scene, there's no reason why NA teams and EU teams would go and get these UK players. Even though there are a few, there's way less than the Australian scene, there are a few good players there. They aren't proving it right now. They aren't playing at international competitions. You can't see that they're good. They haven't really got the dedication. Like, they're not going balls to the wall, like even when they're not getting paid, to prove that they're good enough. So no one is going to try and pick those guys up. The difference is the Australian scene has everything going for it right now in that sense. It's just that they haven't got the teams to do it. Their team experiments have thus far failed in terms of what you'd expect from them. They've only gotten further behind NA because now NA's got 3, 4, 5 teams deep and has got all this talent and now all this money. So it's time to make the logical step and actually mix those Australian players in with the NA scene. And then you're going to have some fantastic NA players, and then teams rather, that have good Australian players in. And you're going to actually see that some of these Australian players are better than they seem from playing in Renegades and Immunity and Chiefs and these other teams out there. I mean, there's even veteran players in the Australian scene that admittedly, because of family situations, probably wouldn't want to move over. Some of those guys absolutely could be like the veteran player in your team who helps bring up the young guy and plays his role and is very sacrificing it. There's all this talent out there and it's being wasted away on a team like Renegades right now. So it's time to integrate.